AMC Eagle. AMC diehards are numerous, but most of them don't even remember the Eagle, even though it was an avant-garde back in the day. We could say it was a proto-crossover with a unibody layout mixed with increased ground clearance and four-wheel drive, which were combined with a variety of body styles. But somehow the Eagle was retrograde at the same time, mainly because of those wood panels that we all wish we could forget. That mashup was plenty enough reason for slow sales back in the day. Today, we don't know anyone who would like to restore such an obscure appearance, so it doesn't surprise that the AMC Eagle is one of the rarest things you will see on American roads today. Range Rover 6x4 Carmichael. While the Range Rover is a very popular luxury SUV, known for its perfect blend of luxury and off-road capabilities, its six-wheel version is one of the rarest SUVs you could see today. That's because it was primarily used as a service vehicle, such as fire trucks and rescue vehicles. This model never came out of a factory line. Instead, there was a specialized conversion company called Carmichael. That company was in business for nearly 25 years, but it managed to sell only around 400 six-wheel versions of the Range Rover. And as we're talking about a service vehicle, it doesn't surprise that most of the examples ended up scrapped. Bombardier Iltis. Once upon a time, a company primarily known for business jets and trains decided to make a military SUV. So it agreed with Volkswagen to produce its own Bombardier badged version of the more common VW Iltis. The two companies agreed to build a plant in Quebec, and in 1983, the first model started rolling out, around 3,000 examples in total. Of course, the SUV was designed for the needs of the Canadian Army, while a certain number was exported to Belgium as well. Then the most interesting part came. The company produced a limited series of examples for civilian use, which were bought by locals predominantly. Even today, you can find a few examples, and with their rugged appearance, they definitely are one of the biggest attractions on Canadian roads. Lamborghini LM001. The less familiar predecessor of the famous LM002 was how Lambo engineers initially imagined their military SUV truck, which would later be adapted and sold to civilians in very limited numbers. Obviously, as a prototype, this one is even rarer, but that's not why we put it on the list. It's because of its distinctive design. First of all, there was a notable difference compared to the LM002 in terms of headlights and front-end design in general. But that's just part of the story. The differences were much deeper in the way that the initial idea was to place the engine in the back. That turned out to be not a particularly great solution, so the more successful LM002 featured its powerful engine at the front, which ensured better weight distribution and overall drivability. Matra-Simca Rancho. French cars have never been particularly popular in the United States. This one never even made it to North America, but anyway, it deserves its place on this list for many reasons, starting from an odd styling that was sending a lot of Land Rover vibes. But under the rugged exterior, there was actually a pretty common vehicle with a car-like platform and nothing more than a modest 1.4-liter engine and front-wheel drive. In other words, it was a lifestyle vehicle without any real-world capabilities. With that in mind, it doesn't surprise that sales numbers are so low that we wonder if there's a single example left on the road, even in its homeland. Rezvani Tank. It wouldn't be fair to make a list like this and not include some of the models that are currently on sale. So we decided to put this one, the Rezvani Tank. It is one of the rarest SUVs on the market, so there's a big chance you're seeing it for the first time now. We presume you're impressed with its angular, war-ready exterior, as well as massive off-road tires. But things are even more impressive under the hood, where you can find a good old 6.2-liter Hellcat engine from Dodge, which has been tuned up to 1,000 horsepower. Another impressive thing is the price. This goes around $260,000 if you pick a fully loaded version. Suzuki XL7. A few decades ago, this Japanese manufacturer had a pretty strong presence in the North American market, so the management felt it was time to level up the game with something bigger and better equipped than a typical Suzuki of the era. Based on Chevy Equinox, the XL7 seemed like a proper design for the American market, but odd styling as well as the lack of identity led to a failure. After a few relatively decent years, the third production year ended with a little bit over 4,000 models sold, which was enough for the management to discontinue the SUV. Soon after, many other things went wrong, and eventually Suzuki vanished from the US market in 2012. Gemballa Tornado 750 GTS. Searching through special, aftermarket versions of popular models is a great way to find a rare SUV. We did the exact thing and found this extremely rare Porsche Cayenne from 2009, designed and executed by German tuner Gemballa. Of course, they took the popular SUV as the basis but elevated it to the next level, both in terms of styling and performance. Of course, unique styling is the first thing to notice, but things were even more impressive under the hood, where the engine was tuned all the way up to 750 horsepower. It was the most capable Cayenne of its time, but also extremely expensive. Allegedly, it was so expensive that the tuner didn't even manage to sell out its super limited series of 50 examples. Chrysler Aspen. Back in 2007, Chrysler launched the Aspen, an SUV that was supposed to compete with full-size luxury SUVs with a sticker price that was a little bit lower compared to well-established names like Escalade and Navigator. But the Aspen never managed to impose itself as a good alternative, probably because of its mild styling and lack of luxury. At the same time, it was too expensive for mainstream buyers, so the fact that production ended just 2 years after the launch doesn't come as a surprise at all. Chrysler even tried with a hybrid version, but it wasn't enough to draw any more attention. Acura SLX. Back in the day, Acura was in the process of establishing its position in the US market, and with the ongoing SUV expansion, the company wanted to step up from luxury sedan territory and compete with luxury SUV makers like Range Rover. On paper, things looked pretty good. A decently capable V6 combined with four-wheel drive, low-range gearing, and soft suspension. But this was essentially an upgraded Isuzu Trooper with all of its downsides. 4 years later, the body-on-frame SUV was discontinued, but Acura learned a valuable lesson and replaced SLX with the unibody MDX, which would soon enough become the brand's best-selling model. Daihatsu Rocky. The 1980s were an era of SUV expansion, and Daihatsu, one of the oldest Japanese car makers, wanted to try its luck in the US market. The idea was to offer a small but capable off-roader, so a model called Rocky came out in 1988. Powered by a 1.6-liter four-cylinder, it wasn't particularly fast, but no one was able to deny its strong off-road performance. Moreover, it even looked pretty appealing whether with a hard or soft top. The only problem was its size. It was too small for the taste of American buyers who had just started adopting Tahoe, Explorer, and similar mid-sized and full-size four-door SUVs. Spyker D12 Peking-to-Paris. The Dutch supercar maker has always been famous for its obscure approach to aesthetics, and the D12 Peking-to-Paris was no exception. Introduced in 2006 as a concept, even today it represents one of the craziest looking SUVs we've seen. With its supercar sheet metal mounted on massive wheels and with high ground clearance, it was definitely ahead of its time. And as the name suggests, it was equipped with a massive W12 engine from Bentley with a max output of 500 horsepower. Unfortunately, the lack of resources was the main reason why this crazy-looking super SUV remained just a concept. Logically, just one example was made, so we can all agree it's a well-deserved place on this list. GMC Envoy XUV. Back in the early 2000s, the GMC Envoy was a pretty popular SUV, so the company decided to launch a so-called XUV version, which would take the best of both worlds, SUVs and pickups. Essentially, it was a long wheelbase Envoy with a redesigned rear end that included a pretty interesting retractable roof design. But it turned out that the mechanism, just like the rest of the vehicle, wasn't as practical as expected. Compared to the standard SUV version, the XUV was heavier and less engaging to drive. So it doesn't surprise that the company managed to sell just 13,000 units over 2 years, even though the management expected to sell 90,000 units on a yearly basis. Land Rover Freelander SE3. The Freelander was a pretty popular small SUV back in the day, but its two-door version with removable roof wasn't. For some crazy reason, Land Rover expected its customers to embrace this highly impractical layout because the non-fixed part of the roof required time to be removed, while there was no adequate storage space for these panels inside the cargo area. At the same time, the Freelander SE3 was notably more expensive than the Wrangler, even though significantly less capable off the road. The SE3 was and still is one of the least appealing models Land Rover ever made, so it's no surprise it vanished from the market after just 2 years. Kia Borrego. Gas prices, global recession, fierce competition. The Kia Borrego had too many things to compete against back in the day. So its failure doesn't come as a surprise. Simply said, the Korean carmaker was late in the game. The concept was presented in 2005, but it wasn't launched before 2009. It was too big and too thirsty for an average Kia buyer. It wasn't good enough to attract traditional 4Runner and Pathfinder customers either. Considering the obvious lack of build quality, thirsty engines, harsh ride, and slow throttle response. On top of all, it was a super dull-looking SUV. Mazda Navajo. For Mazda, years under Ford's management were extremely hard. So hard that we don't even know how the Japanese carmaker managed to survive all those years. Besides the obvious drop in quality, these years are characterized by some pretty impressive failures. Mazda Navajo was one of them. So it doesn't surprise you will rarely see this SUV on the road these days. It's not just about the age. The sales were poor because this was nothing more than a rebadged version of the Explorer. Moreover, Ford allowed only two-door, the less appealing version, to be rebadged, so disaster was pretty much a logical outcome. Land Cruiser FJ45 LV was 7 decades in production and over 10 million units sold. The Land Cruiser is easily the most successful off-roader of all time. And believe it or not, even such a popular vehicle had an iteration that was sold in less than 5,000 examples. We are talking about the FJ45 LV. Of course, it was part of the FJ40 series, but it was the first time that Toyota tried a 4-door layout and a more practical family-oriented design. The lack of commercial success only makes it even more desirable these days. It's extremely rare to find one on sale, and they usually cost a fortune, simply because they are some of the most sought-after models among Land Cruiser enthusiasts. Audi R SQ8 ABT. Fast forward to the present day, and we have another rare and pretty exclusive SUV. This time, it's the hottest and the rarest version of the Audi R SQ8 SUV with the famous ABT badge. This limited edition is still on sale, and the Ingolstadt-based company usually releases around 100 units every year. Logically, that's because the SUV is so special. It borrows most of the parts from the Lamborghini Urus, while the most interesting part is definitely the engine, which puts out around 800 horsepower, enough to ensure a top speed of nearly 200 miles per hour. So it doesn't surprise that owners usually claim they drive not just one of the rarest, but also one of the fastest SUVs around. Isuzu VHA Cross. The VHA Cross is one of the craziest looking SUVs on this list, which perfectly reflects its era, which is all about smooth and rounded futuristic shapes. With such an extreme, concept-like styling, Isuzu hoped it could finally become more than just a producer of work mules. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, even though this SUV actually had a lot of great things to offer. The capable V6 engine was the core, while the main advantage over most competitors was that rugged, body-on-frame architecture borrowed directly from Trooper. But despite all this, the Japanese manufacturer managed to sell just 5,000 units during the entire production. Isuzu Axiom. Isuzu was trying so hard to establish itself in the US market in the 1990s and early 2000s. The tries were numerous, and the Axiom earns its place among the most interesting ones. The first time we saw it was the Spy Kids movie in 2001, while the production started in 2002. Unfortunately, the fact it was advertised by no other than Banderas didn't help much. It was forgotten quickly enough, even though it was a pretty capable off-roader with a torqued-on-demand 4-wheel drive system and a strong V6 engine. We guess it looked too obscure, even for the taste of Americans, while the forgettable driving experience didn't help either. Acura ZDX. When BMW launched the X6 in 2008, suddenly everyone had their own vision of a coupe crossover. As a strong BMW contender, Honda's luxury division wanted to compete in the newly formed segment and offered a model called ZDX. And it was actually a pretty good car. A strong 300 horsepower engine combined with the company's well-known super handling all-wheel drive and excellent chassis, made this crossover a joy to drive. But on the other hand, the styling was, let's say it in a nice way, strange. At the time, it was definitely one of the weirdest looking vehicles around, and definitely wasn't a coupe crossover a typical Acura fanboy imagined. With all that in mind, it doesn't surprise that no more than 5,600 models were sold during a 4-year production, which qualifies it to be considered one of Acura's biggest failures. Lincoln Aviator. The early 2000s were some of the best years for Ford Explorer, and more buyers opting for a high-spec version. The Blue Oval Company thought it would be smart to offer it with a premium badge. They quickly engineered a model called Lincoln Aviator, which used the same chassis but came with a significantly more stylish appearance, more luxurious interior, and of course, an upgraded powertrain. Range-topping versions were even equipped with Mustang's 4.6-liter V8, but that didn't help much. Sales numbers were low, so Lincoln decided to pull it out after just 2 years of production. Today, they are some of the rarest birds on American roads. Pontiac Torrent. The famous brand was already a walking dead in the 2000s, but GM decided to give it another try. This time, it was about a modern crossover, which was the fastest growing segment back in the day. Logically, Pontiac engineers took Chevy Equinox as a basis and tweaked the exterior and interior, while most of the mechanics remained the same. Apparently, that wasn't enough to remind potential buyers how great Pontiac was just a few decades before. The mid-cycle refresh just a few years later didn't help either, nor did the upgraded version with a 264 horsepower V6 engine. The Torrent wasn't a bad car at all, but it wasn't appealing enough to help Pontiac survive either. Toyota RAV4 Convertible. Who would have thought that the world's best-selling SUV would find its place on this list? Well, one of its iterations definitely deserves it. The moment the RAV4 was launched, it became a big hit, so Toyota tried with some additional versions, including shorter 2-door iterations. There were 2 of them, a classic 2-door hardtop and a convertible. And while the former did leave some mark, the convertible didn't draw anyone's attention. The moment the first sales results started coming, Toyota management knew it would be quickly forgotten. So they discontinued it after less than 2 years in production and decided not to complicate things and stick with the standard layout that dominates today's market. BMW X5 Lemons. The X5 stands as one of the most successful luxury SUVs of all time. But did you know that 24 years ago, the Bavarian carmaker built a prototype with more power than today's X5M? You heard us well. The X5 Lemons was equipped with a 700 horsepower V12 McLaren engine the Bavarian engineers took directly from an F1 car. What's even crazier is that it was rear-wheel drive. So it's easy to conclude it's the most brutal and most punishing X5 ever made, able to be driven only by the most skilled race drivers. High ground clearance, raw power, and rear-wheel drive were a recipe for disaster, so BMW management decided it was better not to put it in serial production. It remained just a prototype, which is one example ever built. Suzuki X90. A 2-door Targa top convertible with 4-wheel drive, 2 seats, and a wheelbase shorter than the original Miata. It's not easy to describe the X90, and it's even harder to classify it. It was a class of its own, one of Suzuki's tries to conquer North America. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out well. With just 90 horsepower and insufficient interior room, it wasn't meant for just an average American. Logically, it remained in production for just 2 years, while Suzuki managed to sell around 8,000 examples. Most of them were scrapped long ago, but believe it or not, this model is anything but long forgotten, as it has a small but die-hard following in the United States. Saab 94X. We bet you don't remember this one, even though it wasn't launched all that long ago. The Saab 94X was actually a pretty decent-looking SUV, by Saab standards, of course. It was a well-engineered car as well, which isn't a surprise if we consider that most of the parts were shared with the Cadillac SRX, but it was unfortunate enough to debut only a couple months after the company's bankruptcy and final defunct. For that reason, the Swedish automaker managed to export just a couple of hundred examples to North America, so it clearly isn't a vehicle you see on American roads every day. Isuzu Amigo. The Japanese automaker was trying very hard to succeed in North America. It even launched a pretty stylish soft-top short wheelbase SUV with a name that some would probably find offensive these days. Nevertheless, it was actually a decent-looking and quite capable SUV, which, unlike its four-door sibling, wasn't available in Honda's iteration. But the relatively modest engine lineup and the market's lean to unibody crossovers left the Isuzu for dead. It never manages to impose itself as an appealing proposal, so sales numbers remained in the domain of statistical error. GMC Typhoon. The Typhoon is a desirable collector's item these days, for a good reason. Namely, GMC and GM never had the intention to make big money on it. It was a halo car, a slap into the face for supercar makers, because there was nothing like Typhoon back in the day. A high-performance SUV that was all about acceleration. The good old 4.3-liter V6 was turbocharged and upgraded to 280 horsepower and 360 pound-feet of torque, and was 0 to 60 in about 5.3 seconds. The Typhoon was actually quicker than a Supra. Logically, it came out in pretty limited numbers. As official sources suggest, only 4,697 models were made. Mercury Mountaineer. Even if old enough to remember, most people forgot Mountaineer long ago, especially its first generation, which was produced between 1998 and 2001. As mentioned, the Explorer was dominating back in the day, so Mercury wanted to give it a try. The company wanted to offer a more exclusive iteration with a nicer interior and more equipment, including the standard 5.0-liter V8, but they didn't put much effort into making it distinctive. The slightly altered grille, along with minor revisions to the rear end and a few more minor tweaks, weren't enough to distinguish it from the more mainstream counterpart. So the outcome was just as you would expect: super low sales and a design that no one remembers today. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.